We are a regional museum, history and heritage. We cover 6 counties, 4 counties in Georgia and 2 counties in South Carolina. It's called the CSRA, it's a nice acronym, Central Savannah River Area. My task when I got here, there were some stories not being told, and I got that from then the Board of Directors, or Board of Trustees, and I have been doing, since I arrived in 2004, making sure those voices are heard. I've traveled all over the world, and when I say I'm from Augusta, Georgia, one of the things they say is, that's James Brown. It's not golf, James Brown. I've been in Spain, in Australia. That's the first thing they come up with. So it was a no-brainer doing a James Brown exhibition. But in order to do it, you have to have the trust and a relationship with the family. Anytime you do a performer who has this kind of national and international recognition. So it took about 2 years to get there. We started in about 2006. He passed away in 2006. So I began working on it at that point in time. And by 2008, we opened the exhibition as you see it upstairs. The display is set up the man, his music, and his legacy. What I wanted to do is to make sure they understood what Mr. Brown's contributions are to philanthropy, but I also wanted to show him as a human being. So you go in the first area, you're going to see where his philanthropy was, but you're also going to see toward the end of his life he was asthmatic and diabetic. It shows relationships he's had with different people in the community. One thing in the case I found fascinating, which I had no idea before I got here, was he was a huge fan of the University of Georgia and basically wrote to Junkyard Dogs, one of their songs, for Vince Dooley. And Vince Dooley I have met since then, and he was always a big fan of Mr. Brown. It gives me an opportunity in that same area to talk a little bit about his family. And his relationships over time. My job here, I feel, is that you present the facts as you know them, and you're not editorializing, you're just simply presenting the facts. And you'll see that over and over again through all our displays. What we try to do is, could we create conversations? Absolutely. Could it raise a lot of questions? Absolutely. But we are in the business of presenting those voices. So in the second section with Mr. Brown, I dealt with his musical career. People in this area were not always favorable toward Mr. Brown. You got to see too much of the human side. He did a lot of things that were not legal and got in trouble with the law throughout his career. And that was not part of the stories I wanted to tell. If people asked, I certainly would say it. What I wanted to do was talk about him as a musician and the inroads he created. Hip-hop would not be hip-hop today without Mr. Brown. He created that style of music. He also contributed just to the African-American experience in music. I think I brought up the fact that he was the first African-American that insisted on having his image on his record albums. Before that, you never saw the Ella Fitzgeralds or any of those people. They always had these other interpretations. And Mr. Brown said no more. So every album after that, you see his vision of his face. I also wanted to show that he had a whole variety of styles. He'd do country, he'd do gospel, he'd do R&B, he did rock and roll. There was no musical genre that he was afraid of. He jumped right into it. So that in his musical side, I think that's what I tried to create, or the voice I wanted to be heard, is what he did as contributions to the music world. Now, one thing I didn't point out, another first of Mr. Brown, he was the first African American that went with Bob Hope to Vietnam, and nobody had done it before him, and he did that. I think you see that. I think it's actually in the movie at one point, Get On Up movie. So he did all these first. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about his legacy. And you have the Ushers, and you have the Justin Timberlakes, and the Will I Am, and Michael Jackson. The list goes on and on. MC Hammer, of people he has influenced with his music. His musical stylings, I guess, is probably the best way of presenting it. He just was incredibly brave in what he did. Nothing seemed to be out of his reach. So that's when you go through the exhibit, those are the kind of stories and the voices I want to be heard.
Okay.
Well, I've gotten to know him much better from his children's point of view. One of the kids, Deanna Brown Thomas, is on the board. She's not a kid. She's in her grown up. But what I've done is I give a certain kind of tour when I go through the exhibit upstairs. Well, she does a whole nother kind of tour. This was her dad. And I've learned quite a bit from listening to her and the stories that she's been able to tell. I just pay attention. And that's what I tried to do from the very beginning. I knew that there was a lot of information out there. There was a lot of objects that it could tell his story. I mean, something as simple as I got invited to go out to I had the privilege to go out to his home a couple months after he passed away. And I got to see where he lived and all the things that surrounded him. Well, everything from a Bible in most every room that was open. He was a clothes horse. I don't know another way of saying it. He must have had, it seemed like, at least 3 or 4 walk-in closets that were full. He loved shoes, boots, cowboy boots. When I put things on display, I try to represent him as best I can. It's almost as if he's looking down and he's either saying, "Now that's okay, Nancy," or "No, you can't do that, Nancy." That's the feeling I'm getting sometimes when I do a display. Whether it's here, I'm changing out a costume. We have a display at the convention center that needs to be rotated, and we also have a display of his out at the airport. He's got into my head a little bit. That's, I guess, is the best way of saying it. And I listen. Part of my goal is that when people visit a museum, you want them to see themselves somehow. And it needs to reflect back. And I honestly felt that it needed more than what we were doing in our Augusta story, which is our general history of the area. I wanted to give people an idea of the talent that came out of this area. So we did a whole show on local legends, which talk about people that made a difference. They brought different talents to the forefront. That's what I'm always trying to do with a display. And Mr. Brown was he was a great place to start. And actually, one of the things I did say during earlier is that we would like very much to double the size of this current exhibition. And we're working toward that idea, where we can talk more about what happened on the road. He was beloved internationally. And we have people coming from here. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, I had somebody from Germany that came. He came in very early in the morning on a day that we're normally closed, and he came all the way from Germany to see Mr. Brown. When you type in James Brown or James Brown Museum, Augusta Museum of History comes up when you Google it. So he was in town just to see this exhibition. Well, I couldn't say no. So I let him in there, and he started getting into the reading and everything, so I backed away and let him do his thing, and I actually left him, let him go through. He read every single label, wanted to, everything he could absorb. And about halfway through, I go in there, and I just peek around the corner, and he's in tears. I say, "My goodness, this is the emotion." And it wasn't anything necessarily he was reading, because I go through and I read it, but it's being in that environment. I mean, he felt Mr. Brown and what his contributions were to music. And if you can do that in every exhibit, I mean, that's a home run. Then you know you're making it happen. And I'm always looking for the home run. This area that we represent is a true mixture of different ethnic groups. In Augusta proper, there is no doubt that the African American population is almost 50%. We represent the whole area of the CSRA, as I pointed out. But there are other ethnic groups that I think we need to address that need to see themselves in here, like the Hispanic population. And I'm building those relationships now, but that's not to say these others are going to get left behind. What you want is a balance. I want people to come here to the museum and be able to see themselves. And that only way they're going to do that is if you represent them. And that just takes time. It takes time of building that trust. And that's the next phase that I would like to do.